And that can, at best, it can help reinforce certain assumptions about who we are. And at worst, it could help, or, give us an excuse to not change. So I think it's great to take some of these things and use them to help us understand and make sense, but also understand that there are limitations. I think that there's another aspect to some of these different instruments, and that aspect is correlation. It's a bit like, when we draw a relationship between things, and you can take different qualities and correlate. So if I tend to be quiet in big groups, I am introverted, and these correlations, again, there are helpful because we can understand various contexts and how we might respond. But equally, we can draw conclusions that are not necessarily, we speculate, and they're not necessarily, definitive. And then the third one, I think, for me, is cause and effect.
Hi, and welcome to the Sunday Lunch Project Manager podcast for Sunday, the 4th of February 2024. This is Nigel Creaser, your host, and today we've got Samreen McGregor, the leader Awakener, part one of that conversation. Another great sponsor of the show comes in the form of Air Manual. Air Manual is it's a tool for documenting process, which and best practices. It's a company formed by one of my interviewees, Alexis Kingsbury. Essentially, and I kind of summarised why my view of where we see documentation. A lot of my experience has been people will document something, a process, they'll put it in a Visio diagram that gets loaded onto a SharePoint site or something similar, and then a bunch of that. So then once that diagram's been shared with senior management, they're happy they have a process in the business. But then the detailed procedures underneath it might be in Word documents, just poorly kept and not linked easily and not updated. And what Air Manual does, it allows you to put in it's a tool for doing this kind of thing. You whack it in, the service in there, get in there, put in your process, your flow, and you build it down to as low a level of detail, even to the point of checklists where people can check off they've done it. So it creates that guided checklists, easy to create, easy to maintain, and all in one place. And no one's kind of rooting around to find the SharePoint, and then when you change to new SharePoint services and all that stuff, it's all there. So if you pop along to nigelcreaser.com/airmanual, there's a bit more detail there and a link there to click on to go and get. I think they offer a trial and things like that. So it's something that I think can easily reduce the amount of errors, rework, etc. within our organisations. So take a look. Today, I am delighted to welcome Samreen McGregor to the show. She is an executive coach who works globally with senior leaders and teams across industry sectors. She's described by clients as having a unique ability to create the conditions leaders need to stretch beyond their perceived capabilities, make meaningful contributions, and preserve good health. That's a difficult one at the best of times, so we'll get into that, I'm sure. Her interventions lie in a unique cross-section between business performance, behavioural change, and embodied consciousness. She is half Venezuelan, and where's it gone? My screen's doing something crazy for me now, so I can't see the last bit of that. We'll get into that anyway. Half Venezuelan, half Indian, and bilingual in English and Spanish. There we go. And in recent years, her family has been traversing a journey involving paediatric cancer. Her 9-year-old son survived a traumatic treatment of brain injury, and this life experience, along with unfolding societal ramifications around COVID pandemic and the volatile socio-political economic backdrop, has deepened her personal mission towards awakening leaders into forms of prevention and healing, and the healing effects from inevitable adversities of life. So Samreen, welcome to the show. And as I said, I'd butcher that intro.
No, you did fabulously, and thank you for sharing it, Nigel. It's great to be here today.
It's great to have you on. Tell us a little bit more background, fill in a little bit. There was a lot of things in there.
Yeah.
Where are you? Where are you now? Where have you lived? Where family and all those sort of things? What are you doing now?
I'll start with a bit, just orienting me. So I live in the UK now, and I am married to a British man, and we have two lovely kids, amazing kids who, as you've just introduced, have been through an extraordinary start in their life. But I was born in Venezuela. My father's from India. And I have lived and worked very internationally. I've studied, lived, and worked very internationally all throughout my life. And there is a relevance to that because I do see that as one of the opportunities and really, really positive aspects of me and my upbringing. But I also have experienced adversities that stem from not having a very clear identity. So that's my background and or national background. I've lived and worked in the UK really most of my adult life, and as you've mentioned, I do quite a lot of extremely what I find I'm very passionate about it, but fascinating work across industries with lots of different businesses, and I do have a real interest in understanding how businesses work, the flow through businesses, what drives and undermines performance within business. But equally, I have a real affinity for what drives people. And I'm starting with myself, using myself as an instrument. I'm really curious about how behavioral change happens. I have studied, I've experimented with, and I've researched and trained in a number of. We'll probably talk about a few of them today, but a number of different facets to that. From psychology to neuroscience, and more recently naturopathy and embodied somatic work. And as a result of the unfolding backdrop, as you mentioned as well, I am seeing that the passion that I hold psychologically and behaviorally is now integrating into the body. And I've learned that throughout the last, I would say, 100 years or so, we've become reliant as a species on what we do or what we think. And we analyze things and we rely on a brilliant level of cognition that we have as humans. But I've also started to tap into what our body tells us. And there is deep stored insight that we often don't access because of a bias in thinking. And I know I'm generalizing and I'm simplifying that, but there is quite a lot of new understanding in how that works. And particularly given the backdrop and stress and trauma that we live through. And if you just take a look at the headlines any day at the moment, whether it's internationally, whether it's, the economy and the state of the economy in the UK or globally, understanding how to navigate some of this is becoming more and more important.
Yeah, there's a whole raft of things that I'm going to get into on that from hearing that, and obviously one of the and as soon as you start talking about kind of behavioural stuff and the sort of it opens up a lot of questions for me, because it was something that as a kid many years ago doing my BTEC National Diploma in Business and Finance, they had one section which was on motivation in organisations and a lot of things about Maslow and Hertzberg's hygiene factors, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that, from day one of reading that, I was fascinated by why people do stuff and how to get them to do it, kind of thing. And a lot of that, since then, of reading that I've done and different things I've picked up on, have it made me even more complicated. There's so many different models out there, isn't there, around behaviours and how people behave, whether it be surrounded by idiots, whether it be the disc profiles, whether it be what's the ones where they have the plant and the others? I can't remember. Belbin, which is around for some time, or Ruth, who I had on my podcast a few years ago, talking about strength-based sort of building teams and things like that. How do you? I'm sure that you'll have been into all of these. How do you square these all out? Because to me, sometimes I sit there going, they're very complimentary, but it's too many of them to kind of use all at once. If you know what I mean. How are you using that? And how do you use it in your executive coaching?
Yeah, what a great question, Nigel. And it's interesting because there's 3 different parts to the answer I want to give you, and hopefully this is useful especially for people who are wanting to understand themselves better, wanting to understand their interactions better, and what are those blind spots? What are those things that perfectly well-meaning people get wrong, and why they get them wrong? Or interact, why tensions exist, why conflicts exist, and why certain dynamics get set in that don't help us get closer to our objectives. And look, profiling instruments, psychometric instruments, I still use them. I still use them very much. I'm quite selective about how I use them, because the point you make around there being too many is absolutely valid. But there is a richness in those options being available. Now, the sort of important part to understand here is that they all come from different perspectives and schools of thoughts. And I think, one of the things I highlight in and we'll talk a little bit about the book that I recently published, but is that there's a difference between what Carl Jung would have suggested, that we are born with traits, and some of these traits are personality traits that are based on preferences and how we prefer to do things. Some of them are actually fundamentally based on needs, but these innate qualities of us or characteristics tend to lean on the school of what's called dispositionism. So we're disposed. We are born this way. Whereas there is another school, which it's not necessarily in conflict with or at odds with, but it's just a different way of looking at it. And actually, in my experience, is a complement to is situationism, and that is what the environment around us presents us with. And those factors and conditions then enable us or disable us or undermine us or make things harder or easier. And we need to respond to them. Now, I'm just taking that one lens. If you take a lot of these profiling instruments, they will sit in one of those 2 classifications. Yeah. And as humans, I guess we like simplicity, or we strive for clarity of meaning. And these classifications are helpful because they help us understand, and they help us box something in and help us make sense of it. But there is a limitation to classification. And actually, if you take some of the other, some specific, Myers-Briggs type indicator is probably the most commonly used individual metric. Yeah. You talked about Belbin and the others, but, it's probably the most statistically tested, and it's been used for the longest. And, there's a limitation because it does tend to put you in a particular box, even though there's a spectrum, but it puts you in a particular box. Yeah. And that can, at best, it can help reinforce certain assumptions about who we are. And at worst, it could help, give us an excuse to not change. So I think it's great to take some of these things and use them to help us understand and make sense, but also understand that there are limitations. I think that there's another aspect to some of these different instruments, and that aspect is correlation. It's a bit like, when we draw a relationship between things, and you can take different qualities and correlate. So if I tend to be quiet in big groups, I am introverted. And these correlations, again, they are helpful because we can understand various contexts and how we might respond. But equally, we can draw conclusions that are not necessarily, we speculate, and they're not necessarily, definitive. And then the third one, I think, for me, is cause and effect. So, what is actually causing our behaviors, and what's consistent about that? What are some of the inconsistencies that we need to question and check? And I think that there are some really, really helpful instruments. And again, I use them selectively, but those instruments are the ones that use all three of those. And they don't just classify, they don't just correlate, they will give you some cause and effect, but those are based on the first two. And then the final point I just want to make on this is, for me, I think as my coaching profession has evolved, I've become far more interested in creating a space for people to live with the messy, to live in the gray, to embrace some of the things that are not as clear cut as a classification or a specific correlation between, characteristics. And so I would say I would encourage people to be curious about them, but be aware of some of their limitations.
That's fabulous. It's interesting, that correlation, causation, cause and effect, and all that sort of thing. It's that thing which 90% of news stories that I do hear on the telly, I sit there going and look at it and going, there are causalities being inferred from data. The medical industry keeps a lot of people alive, but a lot of the medical industry sort of statistics there is you do get a lot of things that are, what's the word? They take the data and decide, well, actually, this is likely, more than likely. Now, sometimes that's the only way to do it because it's the only data you've got, but it's more than likely it's going to help, or it's going to be caused by this. And therefore, by taking that data, doing that, right, we'll do this, we'll take you to the next step. If it's not there, that isn't it. But it's sometimes you're not, it isn't always 100% that direction.
Accurate. And
it's something Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted. I got excited.
No,
I've never done that, but
no.
On our podcast.
You say here, you say what you're going to say.
No, I just wanted to build on a point there, because it's very dangerous when we draw or speculate and then draw causalities.
Yeah.
And then particularly when you're saying it's in the media, it can, and I know we're definitely going down a rabbit hole here, but it can definitely take us down. And it's very influential. And so the same thing would apply to personality tests with us as humans, as individuals, and also in our interactions with others. Because a lot of these instruments are there to help us see more clearly and understand. But if it's based on speculative causes, we're creating an illusion that might not even be true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the point is there. You will see that drinking a glass of wine is really good for you. And then tomorrow, drinking a glass of wine is the devil's juice, and it's the worst thing, because there's been a study, and because that study has looked at, it's funny actually. I wrote a little comment on someone who put something about ikigai, and I've actually got a piece of paper on the ikigai concepts, which I really liked. I went through some battles a few years ago, and that was a concept that I was reading about. I've been intrigued, and kind of read the book, and kind of got the idea. I liked the idea of it, and read about the guys in Okinawa, I think it is where a lot of it's coming from. And then I saw a document about documentary about blue zones. These, I think it's called blue zones. These zones where they seem to be people who last a lot of time. And one of the things that they'd noticed as well is that there was a pre-digital era in these areas to be the situation where a grandparent or parent would pass, but in order to continue collecting the pension, because if it wasn't someone local who knew them and it was state, they would collect that pension and continue to collect that pension. So when you look at that, the records of organisations of how long someone's living for was based on how long they're collecting their pension and not necessarily how long they were alive. And so some of that data there was, again, there's the data. we know what it is. Well, actually, when you dig down into the real data underneath and start critically analysing it, and I'm not sure that it was conclusive on that, because again, it was pre-digital, so having the data to go back to and things like that, wasn't it? But it could be that some of these people who've lived for nearly 100 years were 3 people, or at least 2 people who've managed to live that long. So that's just that whole thing. And then you're right. It's like that reinforcement that you get from your horoscope when you read your horoscope, and sometimes some of these personality things will be those reinforcements, the confirmation bias and all that sort of thing, that you're looking at it and going, it says I'm as bad for anyone. That I'll see that the disc profiles, and I'll see myself in that certain profile. But I also see that, and you've got to use it as a tool of how you might change your behaviour, or how to understand someone else's behaviour, rather than to decide, as you say, that's me, so live with it. That's who I am. I can't change, I can't adapt. Because you can change, you can adapt. And that's a choice. It's just harder to, in some cases, if your natural tendency is to do one thing or another. That doesn't mean you're stuck with that. So it's about understand. I see these things as about understanding your default, understanding your preferred, not your absolute.
Yeah, I love that.
That makes sense.
And yes, absolutely. And being really open to understanding further, and not getting definitive and stuck on where we might be. I absolutely agree. Yeah.
So when you're working with executives and coaching them, how do you, because you're dealing with really successful people, I guess, at that level. They've got to a level and they've done pretty good as they are. And maybe there are things they can change. How do you have that conversation? How do you get them to, because it's coaching, it's not about you telling, isn't it? It's about getting them to look at themselves differently. How do you do that?
Yeah,
unless you've got a magic secret sauce that you don't want to share.
Well, of course I've got a secret sauce, that's for sure. But no, it's a really important part of the work when it comes to personal development, and when it comes to recognizing something that might need to change. Because actually, and first of all, defining success is important. Yeah, because success when they're in their 20s and 30s and are, successfully or effectively climbing in line. And I say climbing because there is definitely an upwards movement, metaphorically, in line with their expectations, their aspirations, what society demands or encourages us to consider as success. I think that's really important to take into account, first of all, because these metrics become the criteria by which we as professionals judge whether we are good, whether we are effective, whether we are proficient. So that's, I think, a really important starting point. And my sense is that with most of the people I've worked with over the years, there have been maybe 3 different possibilities, more, but 3. I'm just trying to sort of make it somewhat concise. One is the sort that is really aware that whatever they're doing is not getting them to where they want to be fast enough. Yeah, it's usually a matter of I want to accelerate the pace, or I want to go much further. Yeah, so it's something about that. The second is an individual or a set of individuals that are actually pretty much unaware, but they are being given the feedback either by the organization or by a specific context of colleagues or a boss, that there isn't something that's not working and that they need to change. And if they don't, that there are consequences to that. And then there's a third, which are probably, and this is probably a more spiritual category, which are people who genuinely just have this thirst for learning and changing and developing and evolving. and I would say those are roughly, there's more categories, but I would say that those are roughly the ones. And coming back to your point around, how do you get someone to accept that there is a need for them to change anything in order to enhance, if that, and get, if they've been successful. And actually, I would say that particularly of late, of the last, I would say 7 to 10 years, I've become fairly philosophical about that, because, reflecting on my own experience of life, of ambition, I'm a highly ambitious person, and I mean, to the point where it has affected my health, it's affected my relationships, and I can definitely see these sorts of traits in people, whether it's ambition or whether it's, a relentless need to prove ourselves. There's lots of versions. These are deeply rooted characteristics that come from our life story. And actually, some of that even begins before we were born. They come from previous generations, and they're carried through. Yeah. And I'm learning through epigenetics, this is definitely something that's being proven more and more. Some of the gene expression actually can transmit and transcend. So the work that I do with people is to help them spend time, create the space to know themselves a bit better, to really come to terms with some of those data points that typically, when we're busy and we're just going through life with the rhythm that pulls us, we don't have time or the space or the awareness to notice.
Yeah, I suppose it's one of those things where you can lead a horse to water with some people, and at a point in time, you've got to be ready to take on board and to make a change. And actually, I suppose it's conversations and over time, and eventually someone either will or won't take on board those things. I know I've got situations where I've got people working for me who aren't doing themselves any favours in certain behaviours that they've had, and I've tried to talk to them about it, and I can tell with some people that they don't see that there's a problem. Everyone else is the problem, not them. And whilst they do it with as much love as possible, until they're willing to recognise that the influence of that behaviour on people's perception of them and upon their successes, until they realise that, they can change that, and they will get better results, and they're willing to change it. Even to the situation where I've got people who've they literally will cut their nose off, spite their face, because they want to be right rather than move forward. And in my industry, project delivery, managing stakeholders, negotiating, I find myself apologising for things that aren't my fault a lot. Yeah, I apologise for someone who said, I could argue it's not my fault, it's something that they've done. Now, if it's not commercial, it's not contractual, it's all that sort of thing, I don't care. But I've got to that point. I don't mind. I prefer to move forward than have a big fight about something that I'm not that fussed about. Yeah, I'll take the little bit, and I think but some people can't do that and won't do that, and I understand why they won't, because when it's right, and there are some people out there who take advantage of that. They're just irritating, and out of principle, they just wind people up, and we shouldn't have to stand up for that. But it's time kind of choosing your battles sometimes, isn't it? I just find that willingness to learn, that constant learning, is so powerful for us all, because when we realise we're always wrong, or realise that we could always be wrong, we always make sure that what we're doing is the right thing.
Yeah,
it's not a weakness; it's a strength. Because if you do that reflection, you realise actually Am I doing the best? And in imposter syndrome that sits out there in a lot of scenarios, and you see a lot of talk about it at the moment, and that is that's the fundamental there of it. It's questioning yourself, but actually, is that something? Actually, it's healthy skepticism, as long as it's healthy skepticism about your own decisions, rather than debilitating. Stop it saying I can't do anything. Then that's right. That's what we need, isn't it? Everyone needs that because we're not always right. Some people, I'm sure, are listening to this saying, well, I am, but there you go. Yeah.
I don't know. I agree with you. I think that need for questioning and the ability to step back and see more than one side, see more than our own side, is definitely in high demand. Let's put it that way. Particularly in workplaces, in project environments. I'm very familiar with the negotiation that goes on in project environments. There's always the need to deliver within finite resources and budget and time. So there will always be a need for negotiation. Now, I would say, certainly in my own experience of working in project environments, in any workplace environment, it would probably be consistent, is that there is a layer, a very clear layer, and it's quite a thick layer, I would say, at which we interact with one another. And that layer is very task focused, and we get hired to do a job. Most of us, I would say, show up in that job or in that, performing tasks that we want to do well. And I would also say that most of us want to collaborate to do well at that level, at that sort of superficial level. What, in my experience, and certainly what I'm learning more and more, is that some of the deeper layers, which are infused with the muscle memory of the fabric of the organization or the industry that you might be working with, infused with politics, infused with what we each bring as individuals, a big heavy bag filled with rocks, made up life experience, and some of those are strong, deeply stuck emotions that may have actually been true in a previous time as children or throughout our life, has an impact on how we then interact at that level, at that task level. And I think some of the things that you were saying there, I mean, I recognize so many of them. In fact, I was talking to somebody just yesterday in an organization that I'm working with. I'm doing a management development program. I'm part of a team, and we were specifically talking about the fact that she sees the report. She's got 2 reports only. She sees them as extremely talented. She doesn't understand why she's going to a management program, because actually the 2 people that report to her are probably more experienced than she is, and she really, really sees them as very, very high potential people. And then I said, so what other people do you deal with? And she said, well, I've got a lot of stakeholders. And I said, and how would you describe the process of interacting with them? And she goes, well, I've got to make sure that they get things done. And, there are a few things that actually cause the biggest issues. And there are only a few, but they cause a lot of stress, and they cause a lot of delay, and they cause a lot of obstacles. And so we started to have this conversation about, well, what gets in the way? And actually, when it came down to it, it's a lack of real connection between her and some of these stakeholders. She doesn't really know where they stand on certain things, but actually she doesn't know them. They're just focusing on the task and the negotiation between the tasks. And she said, well, actually, what I'm learning is I need to spend a bit more time just understanding them as humans before we force our own needs onto each other in those tasks. And I would say that, Nigel, is really what underpins a lot of these unnecessary energy forces that pull us apart rather than pull us together.
Yeah, Yeah, I can hear that. It is that situation where I've and I hark back to a project from some time ago where I was running the project and I'd come into it and they'd been having trouble with this project for quite a few years, actually trying to get it done, different ways of doing it. And there was 2 different organisations that were essentially having a pitched battle. And it just escalated over time to the point where if one said the sky was blue, the other would say it was green. It just got to that, almost that level of, because they weren't able to listen to the others so much. And they didn't care about the others' point of view. They didn't care about their problems. It was them being unreasonable. It was all that kind of thing. And we ended up having it was quite a big team of people, 30 people workshop we pulled together about, right, this is this thing. We're breaking it down into pieces. This is how we're going to do it. Right. You from that organisation, you from that organisation, you from that organisation, you're looking at that bit. And we kind of broke them into groups to go and solve the problem. And solve the problem together. So they all had their own context about, well, what happens? So work it out, explain how it's going to happen, what happens, what are the problems. And what it ended up doing, there was still some personality clashes in there, but what it did actually do was break down so that the people within the one organisation knew more about what the people in the other organisation were doing, and them doing this meant this to them, and that's why that was hard for them, and them doing this meant it was hard for them. And they got that conversation going, and those stakeholder conversations that not at that senior management level. This is an operational level in some ways. By doing that, these guys then started clicking and started working and started making allowances from each other. It was partly relationship building of taking them out of the normal environments they were in, but also that exposing them to each other's roles. And like you say, it's about understanding that person, and where one person saying, when you do that at 4:30, that means I'm not home till 7:00 and I don't see my kids. When people start to see those kind of impacts, they start to think, oh yeah, hang on a minute, I really need this at 4:30. Ring them up and go, I'm sorry, we really need it. I know it's going to cause you a problem, rather than why aren't you doing it? And it changes that dynamic, and it's so critical for all of us. I think that we think about, and I'm as guilty as anyone as sitting there going, bloody idiots! Why aren't they doing it right? Why aren't they doing what I'm doing? Why are they taking so long? Why are they doing that? And then you have to sit back and go, hang on, let's think why. Okay, I understand why. How can I help? How am I causing the problem, or am I helping? And it's hard to do because we're all under pressure to deliver. Another great sponsor of the show comes in the form of Air Manual. Air Manual is it's a tool for documenting process, which and best practices. It's a company formed by one of my interviewees, Alexis Kingsbury. Essentially, and I kind of summarised why my view of where we see documentation, a lot of my experience has been people will document something, a process, they'll put it in a Visio diagram that gets loaded onto a SharePoint site or something similar, and then a bunch of that. So then once that diagram's been shared with senior management, they're happy they have a process in the business. But then the detailed procedures underneath it might be in Word documents, in just poorly kept and not linked easily and not updated. And what Air Manual does, it allows you to put in it's a tool for doing this kind of thing. You whack it in, the service in there, get in there, put in your process, your flow, and you build it down to as low a level of detail, even to the point of checklists where people can check off they've done it. So it creates that guided checklists, easy to create, easy to maintain, and all in one place. And no one's kind of rooting around to find the SharePoint, and then when you change to new SharePoint services and all that stuff, it's all there. So if you pop along to nigelpriester.com/airmanual, There's a bit more detail there and a link there to click on to go and get. I think they offer a trial and things like that. So it's something that I think can easily reduce the amount of errors, rework, etc. within our organisation. So take a look. Well, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of that conversation, and come back next week, have a listen to part 2. Speak soon. Bye. Hope you enjoyed that. But you're thinking, ooh, I wonder what the next bit's going to be. Yeah, it's frustrating, isn't it? You heard at the beginning of the show where I said there's a way around that. So if you're really itching and you want to hear the next bit of this show, jump down to Patreon, have a look, find the one that's got a little lock on it, click on it, and you'll be able to get the second half along with the first half all together. And you won't get this annoying bit or the annoying bit at the beginning that I just done as well. So yeah, give it a go. It's only a price of a coffee. Cheers. So this is my final wrap up. Every week you're going to hear this. You're going to get bored of it, but you can always click next podcast if so. If you have enjoyed it, if you listen to this podcast to the end of this show and you think that was great, I'd love to be able to help Nige out. There are loads of ways you can do it. The first and obvious way is to share the podcast. Send it out to people. If you know colleagues and friends who'd benefit from it, you think they'd enjoy it, just send them the link. Grab one of the links or send them to www.nigelcreaser.com/podcasts. That's www.nigelcreaser.com/podcasts, and that will push them over to a Linktree link, and it's got all of the different ways they can consume the podcast. If you are feeling generous and have a big bag of cash, you could grab a copy of one of my books. Obviously, they're available in all the usual places, in print and digital. Again, jump on the website, www.nigelcreaser.com/shop, and that will give you a list of all the different ways that you can contribute and grab copies of the book. Also got links to all my guests' books on there as well, where I get a little bit of a kickback from them. If you are of a sporting mind, I have a number through doing some of my judo and running antics. I've managed to secure a few affiliate links and affiliates there as well. So in there, somewhere in the sponsors page, there's links to those as well. So clicking onto those and grabbing if you're looking to get super fit, then that would be fabulous as well. And I get a little kickback from those. I have a Patreon account. It's patreon.com/sundaylunchpm. So again, you can ping something in there, buy me a coffee or whatever. And finally, obviously the most important is coming back, listen again, because the more of you that come back, the more visibility I get, because there's more times that it's downloaded and all the SEO works and things like that. So yeah, that's it. So if you can help me out, I would be much appreciated. If you can't, don't worry about it. Thank you very much. Cheers now. Bye. My latest, the latest affiliate that I've got on the show now is Riverside. I use Riverside to do my interviews, Riverside FM. It kind of offers you a whole, if you like, micro studio management producer tooling and goes beyond that. Has a really good free layer. And I've been using it for a while now. I find it really good. When I've had issues, even though I'm not on one of the higher paid levels, the support has been quick, responsive, and of high quality, and people keen to help me. The organisation seems really good. The product seems really intuitive. And quality is really good as well. And it's a clever way of doing it is when you're recording through your browsers, so you've not got loads of desktop resources being used compared to some other products that I've used. And what they also do is they stream a lower quality version of it up onto as you're doing the interview, so you're not burning bandwidth while you're doing the interview and potentially impacting on the quality of the conversation. And then at the end, it uploads it, the higher quality from your browser. It's just a really good way of doing it. So if you are thinking of doing a podcast and know someone who's doing a podcast, I would recommend using this tool. I found it really good. Best of the tools that I've tried using to date. And you can get that at nigelcreaser.com/riverside, and that will redirect you to my kickback page on their site, and there I will get a little kickback from them. So take a look. Thanks. Well, it's goodbye from me, Nigel Creaser, and it's goodbye from him, the Sunday Lunch PM. Goodbye.